Summer 1943. Camp Crossville, Tennessee. The German soldier stared at the brown, bubbling liquid in the glass bottle like it was a trick of light. After years of fighting in the deserts of North Africa, surviving on dry biscuits and ersatz coffee, the strange, sweet drink called Coca-Cola seemed like something out of a dream. 5 cents a bottle. The guards told him it was the same price American children paid with their pocket money. That summer, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war arrived in the United States, men who had been fed a steady diet of propaganda about a weak, decadent America. But within days, that illusion began to crumble. In the prison canteens, they saw rows of soft drinks, candy bars, and ice cream, ordinary American foods that felt impossible back home. To these men, the first sip of Coca-Cola was more than refreshment. It was revelation. Every bubble carried a quiet message. You were lied to. The taste of sugar and carbonation did what no Allied leaflet could. It began to dismantle the foundation of Nazi ideology, one bottle at a time. Before long, these soldiers discovered a nation where ice cream was a daily treat, where candy bars were sold in every store, and where children tossed away half-eaten chocolate without a second thought. It was a civilization built on abundance so vast it extended even to captured enemies. Back in North Africa, the same men had fought and starved for months beneath the desert sun. When they surrendered in Tunisia, they expected punishment and deprivation. Instead, they were served pancakes with syrup, eggs, and real milk. To men who hadn't seen such food in years, it was as if they had crossed into another world, one where even enemies were fed better than soldiers of the Reich. The message was simple but devastating. American strength didn't come from fear or obedience. It came from production, creativity, and comfort. For men raised to worship discipline and sacrifice, this casual generosity was a form of quiet shock therapy. The transformation had only begun, because soon these prisoners would board Liberty ships, mass-produced marvels of industry, where the lessons of abundance continued in the most unexpected ways. As they sailed toward America, the prisoners didn't yet realize that the voyage itself would become their first classroom, where ice cream and fresh bread at sea would teach them more about power than any weapon ever could. The Atlantic wind carried the scent of salt and diesel as the Liberty ship creaked forward under the morning sun. Thousands of German prisoners stood at the rails, staring at a vessel unlike any they'd ever imagined. The Americans had built these ships faster than anyone thought possible, one every 42 hours at peak production. To men from a nation obsessed with precision, this mass production seemed like sorcery. Below deck, confusion turned to disbelief. Their rations, 3,500 calories a day, matched the American crew's. Fresh bread, meat, vegetables, and hot coffee with sugar and milk. For soldiers who had marched on crusts and black water, this was luxury beyond logic. The U.S. Navy logs even recorded that on July 4, 1943, ice cream was served at sea. The prisoners watched in silent awe as sailors worked refrigeration units below deck, machines that kept milk and meat fresh mid-ocean. Germany's fleet, by contrast, could barely feed its own men ashore. Here, their enemies had built floating factories of comfort. The message was unmistakable. America's strength wasn't brutality, but capacity. Days later, the Liberty ships docked at Norfolk, Virginia. The harbor sprawled like a small city, for 1,000 acres of cranes, warehouses, and piers humming with endless motion. German officers who had memorized maps of Europe's ports realized with quiet despair that this single base handled more cargo daily than Hamburg did in a week. Through the wire fences, prisoners glimpsed dockside shops stocked with candy bars from brands they'd never heard of: Hershey, Mars, Nestle. The prices were the same for everyone: 5 cents. Equality through sugar. A lesson more powerful than any ideology class. When they boarded the trains bound for the interior, the education continued. No cattle cars, no filth. Passenger coaches with cushioned seats and dining cars that served fried chicken, vegetables, and pie. At first they thought it was propaganda. Then they learned this was simply normal American travel. At every turn, the evidence multiplied. Abundance wasn't an illusion. It was infrastructure. America's power wasn't measured by fear, but by the ordinary miracle of everyone eating well. But if the voyage and the journey astonished them, what waited inland would completely dismantle everything they believed. Behind the fences of Camp Crossville, the real transformation was about to begin. When the train finally slowed near the wooded hills of Tennessee, the prisoners expected barbed wire, barking dogs, and hunger. What they found instead was electricity humming through every building, clean barracks with hot water, and a canteen stocked with brands they'd never heard of. Camp Crossville was not a dungeon. It was a mirror reflecting a civilization they had been told didn't exist. The camp's exchange store became a shrine of disbelief. On its wooden shelves stood glass bottles of Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, and RC Cola, each perfectly chilled. Candy bars stacked in neat rows, Hershey, Mars, Milky Way, Baby Ruth. A day's wage, 80 cents, could buy 16 of these treasures. For men who'd lived on scarcity, the math itself felt impossible. Coca-Cola quickly became more than a drink. It was a symbol. The same bottle cost the same everywhere, from Maine to Texas, and it always tasted identical. German engineers among the prisoners were stunned. How could a democracy produce such precision, such consistency, across an entire continent? Deliveries came weekly. Hundreds of cases rolled in like clockwork. The Coca-Cola trucks pulled up to the gates, unloaded crates, and drove off toward the next camp. Abundance, it seemed, was routine logistics. The POWs began to realize that this soft drink represented something far larger. A society that could mass-produce pleasure as efficiently as it built weapons. Then came ice cream, unthinkable luxury reborn in captivity. During summer 1943, American camps with refrigeration served it regularly. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the 4th of July celebration featured soldiers hand-cranking freezers filled with cream, sugar, and salt. The POWs stared as mountains of cold dessert formed in the heat. It was the taste of a civilization that could afford delight. Even the waste seemed supernatural. When humidity ruined several hundred pounds of sugar at Camp Aliceville, the kitchen staff simply threw it away. German cooks gasped. In their homeland, that would have been unthinkable. For the first time, they realized that waste itself could be a sign of wealth. These daily miracles eroded ideology faster than any lecture could. Nazi pride had taught them that scarcity was noble, that suffering proved superiority. But here, abundance had dignity of its own. Each bottle of soda, each scoop of ice cream, whispered the same quiet truth. Freedom feeds itself. But the sweetest shock was still to come. When Thanksgiving arrived, America's celebration of gratitude would shatter the last illusions these men had left. By autumn 1943, German prisoners had settled into the rhythm of captivity. They worked, they read, they wrote letters home, but nothing could prepare them for what came in November. On Thanksgiving morning, every camp in America served the same meal as the U.S. Army itself. Roast turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, coffee, and milk. As trays of steaming food passed down the rows, silence fell. For men who had eaten cabbage soup and black bread for years, this wasn't just generosity, it was contradiction made edible. Their captors were feeding them like equals. Nazi propaganda had promised cruelty. Instead, they found kindness organized with military precision. Quartermaster records reveal the staggering scale of that meal. Over 400,000 prisoners served turkey dinners on the same day, from Maine to California. The logistics alone, turkey, milk, vegetables, sugar, flour, spoke volumes about American industrial muscle. It wasn't just food. It was a message written in abundance. We have so much, even our enemies will never starve here. Then came Christmas. Church groups, civic organizations, and ordinary families sent tens of thousands of care packages to German prisoners. Inside were homemade cookies, candies, cigarettes, puzzles, and books. In Tonkawa, Oklahoma, local families even baked gingerbread for the men who had once fought against their sons. It was forgiveness wrapped in sugar and paper. The American Friends Service Committee distributed 50,000 Christmas boxes that year alone. Some were addressed personally, from the Smith family, Kansas. For the POWs, these names, ordinary American families, became proof that compassion existed without propaganda, without permission. In those moments, the hierarchy they had lived under shattered completely. The nation they were taught to despise had turned mercy into a weapon more powerful than fear. To receive gifts from strangers during wartime, cookies, not commands, was to realize that the American idea of victory was moral as much as military. Across hundreds of camps, the lesson was repeated every holiday, every meal, every act of unnecessary kindness. And by spring, the men who once fought for Hitler began writing letters home describing a world their families could scarcely believe existed. Yet the most powerful education came not from the holidays, but from work itself. When German prisoners stepped outside the fences to harvest American crops and witness its food industry up close, the real revelation began. By 1944, the fences had opened, not in trust, but in labor. As American manpower thinned, thousands of German prisoners were sent to work across the nation's farmlands and food plants. For the first time, they saw America unfiltered. Its factories roaring, its orchards stretching to the horizon, its highways filled with motion. Each workday became a lesson in scale. In Michigan, prisoners climbed ladders among cherry trees heavy with fruit. Harvests so large that single orchards produced tons meant only to decorate ice cream sundaes. The realization hit hard. America used more fruit for garnish than Germany could feed its citizens for a week. In Colorado and Nebraska, the men shoveled sugar beets into conveyors that fed vast processing plants. Steam hissed, gears turned, belts moved endlessly. They learned that the United States produced over 7 million tons of sugar annually, while their homeland rationed a few hundred grams per person. For men raised to believe in German industrial superiority, it was a quiet humiliation. At canneries, they watched Americans discard perfectly edible fruit for being slightly misshapen. Waste that would have been treasure in Europe was tossed aside for animal feed. Efficiency, it seemed, had surpassed necessity. The prisoners began to understand that abundance wasn't accidental. It was systematic. Some were sent to work near schools, where they witnessed children lining up for hot lunches, milk, bread, vegetables, even dessert. In one school cafeteria, a POW stared in silence as American children bought ice cream for a nickel. For him, it was the final proof. The society that could feed its children ice cream during war would never lose. Even in small-town diners, under guard, prisoners experienced equality they'd never known. A steelworker and a banker sat side by side, ordering the same meal for the same price. Democracy, they realized, was not chaos, it was fairness in action. From the orchards to the factories, from sugar mills to diners, every moment taught the same lesson. America's power came from creation, not control. Here, freedom didn't mean disorder, it meant output. But the lesson wouldn't end in captivity. When these men finally returned to their broken homeland, they carried more than memories. They carried the blueprint of a new Germany, built not on conquest, but on abundance. When the war finally ended, the trains began moving in the opposite direction. Between 1945 and 1946, tens of thousands of German prisoners boarded ships bound for a homeland they no longer recognized, and a worldview they no longer believed in. They had arrived in America as soldiers of the Reich. They returned as witnesses to a civilization built on generosity. In the ruins of Germany, they found families starving, children hollow-eyed, and shelves empty. Yet many of these returning men were heavier, healthier, and better fed than they'd ever been in their lives. Their bodies carried the proof that America's abundance had been real. Some opened their last Red Cross parcels and shared what they had saved: chocolate bars, instant coffee, tinned meat. For German children who hadn't tasted sweetness in years, a Hershey bar was a miracle. A father would smile and whisper, "This is what America tastes like." They spoke of things that sounded like fantasy. Coca-Cola for 5 cents, ice cream every Sunday, candy for sale in every store. First, no one believed them. Then the Marshall Plan arrived, and America began sending food and money to rebuild the very nation that had tried to destroy it. The stories of kindness suddenly made sense. Former POWs carried lessons, not resentment. They had seen how democracy could outproduce dictatorship, how efficiency and equality could coexist. Many entered business and industry, determined to rebuild Germany not as a fortress, but as a factory of prosperity. Coca-Cola returned to West Germany in 1949. Ice cream parlors, American-style diners, and supermarkets soon followed. What had once been symbols of surrender became icons of modern life. The men who had tasted freedom in captivity now sold it to their own people. For decades, historians debated how the Allies re-educated Germany. But the truth is simpler. It wasn't leaflets or lectures. It was pancakes, ice cream, and a 5-cent bottle of Coke. America didn't just defeat fascism. It replaced it with sweetness. To those men, democracy would forever taste like sugar and carbonation. They had learned that power wasn't measured in weapons, but in the ability to share comfort, even with your enemies. In the end, America's greatest weapon wasn't its army. It was its abundance. A victory not of conquest, but of compassion. Because sometimes, the sweetest taste of freedom comes from a spoonful of ice cream.